Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Dialexicon podcast, a podcast targeted at the youth, where we critically engage in philosophy and correlate philosophy research to contemporary and social issues, all at an easy to understand and digestible level. My name is Saurish and I'm your host. This week, we're joined by Dr. Eliot Michaelson, who is a reader in the Department of Philosophy at King's College London and an honorary associate professor of linguistics at University College London. Hi, Dr. Michaelson. How are you today?
Pretty good. Thanks for having me on, Suresh.
Of course, thank you for your time and for being here today. So before we begin our discussion, I ask all my guests this one question, and I wanted to ask you as well. How did you get into philosophy and what stood out to you?
Sorry, what was the second part of that?
What stood out to you in
Oh,
philosophy?
what stood out to me? I think like many people, I just took a really good philosophy class when I was an undergraduate. For me, it was the first course that I took, although I didn't like immediately know that I wanted to continue studying philosophy, but it sort of stuck with me. Um, Germinated, got me to keep reading philosophy even, well after the class was done and when I wasn't taking any philosophy courses. That seemed like a pretty good sign that maybe I should, go back and study it some more. And that's basically what I did. Um, I don't know what that any one thing stood out to me. I mean, I appreciated the breadth of the field. Uh, yeah. I don't know. I thought maybe it would help me understand things like what it is to lead a good life. I'm still waiting for that, but maybe one day. It's pretty interesting in the meanwhile, though. So, yeah. I mean, one of the best things about doing it professionally certainly is that when you get bored with whatever you're working on, you can just pick something completely different and start working on that, and that's lovely. I mean, my friends in the sciences, once you have a lab geared up, you just can't do that. But all we have to do is go out and buy a couple books or find PDFs of them or something, and you're good to go. Um, so that's a rather nice part of the field, I have to say.
Yeah, that sounds like honestly like a dream, especially when it comes to work. I wanted to ask, like, when you were in college, were there like specific courses that you found really interesting at the time, or was it just like the kind of breadth of philosophy was really interesting?
No, I mean I liked most of my philosophy courses. I mean, so the first one that I took was a political philosophy course. That was great. It really I think even to this day shapes kind of a lot of things I think about, even though I don't work primarily on political philosophy, but I think it was a very nice way into the field. Um, and then, I mean, I mostly do philosophy of language now, so I should certainly say, my philosophy of language course as an undergraduate, which I took in my senior year. I didn't think it was the kind of thing I was interested in most of the way through my time as an undergraduate. I thought I wanted to work on the history of philosophy. That's what my undergraduate thesis was on, and I loved it. It was super fun. Took a couple great history of philosophy courses at the University of Chicago, where I did part of my undergraduate. Um, and yeah, they were great. But my my senior year, I took a philosophy of language course with a guy named Joseph Stern, who's still around. I think partly retired now. He's not in Chicago anymore, but I think he maybe is still doing some stuff. I think he's moved back to Israel. Moved to Israel, I should say. Um, and yeah, it was just blew my mind. It also was the worst grade that I got in my time as an undergraduate. I mean, I found it incredibly confusing, had really no idea what was going on, but I just had this inkling like this was really interesting. And yeah, somehow that got under my skin and kept working on it. Yeah. I saw Joseph years later, and he actually refused to write a letter for me for graduate school unless I was going to go study history of philosophy. So I'd also taken a history of philosophy course from him. He taught the medieval philosophy course at Chicago, which was really good. And I did very well in that. And he said, well, if you want a history letter, I'll write you a letter. If you want a letter to do contemporary, analytic stuff, no. Um, and so I saw him years later and reminded him of this. And he was like, well, you might have been much better at history, which I don't know, he might in fact be right about, but I'm glad I got into graduate school even without his letter. And he seems to think I've turned out all right, so I'll take that too.
That's a really funny story. And then like I just wanted to ask this because like philosophy is not mandated in schools in the United States. So do you think if you had gotten into philosophy at an earlier age, it would have been easier for you in college, or like would these things be something that you would have already been interested in? And like I don't know. The main reason I'm asking is just because like obviously the podcast exists for the youth. And is that something that you think would be beneficial for students as well?
Yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, yeah, I don't, I don't even really remember what I was like when I was 16 years old, 17 years old. I think I was kind of, yeah, I don't know. I feel like I probably thought I had too many answers to things to have really appreciated what it is that philosophy is all about and, can really do for you as a thinker. So I don't know that I would have been the right person to get much out of it at that point. I feel like, you know, the older I get, the more I love it. Uh, I don't know why. I feel like I just get more confused and have fewer answers to things. And I think that's honestly, you know, kind of the right way to be doing philosophy. So yeah, my temperament, I don't feel like I would have gotten a lot out of a philosophy course when I was 16, to the extent that I can remember. I'm certainly glad that, I had some really good philosophy courses in my early 20s when something had clicked, and I was ready for it. But yeah, I assume that there are people out there that are, different than I was, and I wish more was available for them. So I think it's cool that you guys are doing this, and yeah. Um, I mean, philosophy is the kind of thing that you can come back to time and time again, which is also nice. Sometimes I just go off and read novels for a month and then come back and rediscover, like, really loving philosophy, and that's nice too. Um, it's not something that you know you have to get into all at once. It's always there. We don't solve anything, so it doesn't go away.
Right, yeah. And I like the point that you mentioned, like it almost is like like wine does. Like it gets better as you get older. And like could you elaborate on that point? Like maybe how like your research over the years has also changed in accordance with that?
Well, I mean, look, as a professional philosopher, once you get on to a certain stage, it becomes a lot easier to admit that you really don't know what you're talking about certain things, because there's not a lot of professional incentive any longer for you to, pretend like you have some great new answer to this old question. Like you don't have to pretend that anymore. So it turns out once you don't have to pretend that anymore. Many of us, at least, start becoming a lot more comfortable just saying that. I mean, some people continue to pretend they have great new answers to old questions, but a lot of us, realize, oh, maybe that was never something I had, and that's okay. I can maybe still make a bit more progress than where we got to, or help put things in a way that's going to be clear, or think about some new issue that wasn't around for people to think about for a long time, and that can be fun too, even if you're applying, older tools that have been honed by your predecessors to a new issue. It can still surprise you what's there in the details. So yeah, I think a lot. I don't know that it's something that it's necessarily an activity that ages like wine. I mean, although you and I are both from California, we should both know. Well, you're below drinking age, so maybe you don't know this yet. But lots of wine doesn't age well. Some does. A lot does not. Philosophy, thankfully, not like that. But yeah, it's I don't know that it's like that for everyone. Some people do lose interest over time, and that's okay too. Like that happens, and hopefully, they find a way to rediscover their interest in it, with some time away. I think that happens for a lot of us. That certainly happened for me, even though like I feel like my long-term trajectory is loving philosophy more the older I get. There are periods where I don't. And there's never any guarantees that philosophy loves you back. So that's you have to go through these periods of just feeling like you're not making any progress, and that's very frustrating. Yeah, it's funny like that. It's very unpredictable, but if you're lucky enough to feel like your long-term trajectory is that you like it more, then it's a nice thing at the very least. I can't explain why. No.
No, that makes sense. And maybe like we can move on now to something where you have established something in a paper called "What's New About Fake News." So there's like a lot of problems right now in many different climates, not just America, but all different countries and different political scenes about fake news. So what exactly is fake news, and what is the standard journalistic practice, and why is it important to have a definition of fake news? And do maybe like if you want to also add in your response, like do different parties have different definitions of fake news?
Okay, cool, awesome. Good questions. So let me try to take them one at a time. There were a bunch there. So I worked on this paper with some long-term collaborators of mine, Jessica Papp and Rachel Sturkin, a few years ago when there was sort of a flurry of philosophical interest and work on fake news, and indeed a sort of flurry of broader societal interest on fake news, about fake news. Now, obviously, like this is part of sort of a wider set of questions that we should be asking ourselves about things like misinformation, disinformation, just broader anti-democratic tendencies in our political sphere, other related concerns about things that I think sometimes get called knowledge resistance, right? So electorates, even in very wealthy countries that presumably are some of the best equipped electorates in history, if they want to have good access to information, education, the sorts of things that we would like to think would go hand in hand with like good governance, but don't seem to, right? So there's a broader set of questions here about like how can we improve our overall epistemic environment so that we can actually make good decisions together as political beings, right? And this project on fake news is obviously just like one very small slice of that. But I want to emphasize, like, it's not a boring slice of that on the one hand. It's fun, it's interesting, but it's certainly like not exhaustive of all these other like super interesting questions that lots of rad philosophers are working on these days, like Regina Rini, Josh Habgood-Koot, just a couple offhand, tons more, but I should have come prepared with a list of names and I didn't. But anyway, just to mention that, like, there's a broad set of like really cool interrelated issues here, and I don't want to oversell the interest of the fake news stuff. On the other hand, yeah, there's something interesting about fake news, and we thought the philosophical discourse at the point when we were kind of writing this paper was missing out on something that we thought was sort of important. And so at the point when we were working on this, almost every definition of fake news that we could find in the philosophical literature had it that fake news had to be intentional on the part of the producer, right? So the producer needed to have some sort of intention to deceive the audience, or at least produce something that was likely to be deceptive to the audience, sort of knowingly. And we thought, yeah, this just doesn't seem to fit some paradigm cases of fake news, as it's sort of talked about in everyday discourse, where Pizzagate is sort of this, we took it, real paradigm story of fake news. So just to refresh people, hopefully I'll get this right, because I haven't actually reread the relevant articles on the Pizzagate saga in a little while. But so Pizzagate was this theory that Hillary Clinton and other prominent Democrats were running a child sex trafficking ring out of a pretty pedestrian pizza restaurant in Washington, D.C. I think it was called Comet Pizza. And it there I don't remember the name of the person who originated this, but there's sort of every reason to believe that this person may really have believed that he had cracked this secret code in Hillary Clinton's leaked emails, indicating that uh, um, she was involved in this child sex trafficking ring. Um, I don't think we know this for sure, but it seems at least like a real open possibility about what we know of this case. So let's just focus on the case where this person really does genuinely believe that he has somehow happened on the secret code in Hillary Clinton's emails where, cheese pizza means child pornography. Not quite sure why, except that they start with the same letters. In that case, this guy really thinks that he's revealing the truth to, the world at large about these heinous crimes that Hillary Clinton was up to. And, that doesn't look very much like deception. It might involve a lot of unjustified beliefs about having cracked this code. It might involve a lot of other sort of bad, dodgy epistemic stuff going on in the background. But a deceptive intent doesn't look like a necessary part of that, right? And so we just thought, look, this is like one of the most talked about cases of fake news going on at the time we were writing that paper. This just doesn't match what philosophers are talking about, right? So sure, there is a phenomenon that we could be interested in of generating things that sort of look like news stories, people treat like news stories with deceptive intent, right? That are false with the intention that other people take them up and treat them as true or something along those lines. But it just doesn't look like plausibly a description of what was going on in the Pizzagate case. And we thought, yeah, that maybe then isn't the phenomenon we should be focusing on. Once we sort of started going down that line, we started to think to ourselves, well, there might be other reasons not to want to focus on that phenomenon. So knowing when people are trying to be deceptive is actually quite tough, right? I mean, obviously in our daily lives, we make lots of assumptions about when other people are being deceptive to us. But we're often probably wrong, right? You know, people also self-deceive, and then it's quite difficult to say for sure, with any sort of certainty, even if we know all the psychological facts, whether this person is really being deceptive when they've self-deceived into thinking that they're not being deceptive here, but maybe there's some underlying psychological state that looks kind of deception-like. That's another hard philosophical question about the nature of deception, but maybe not one we want to get into every time we want to figure out if a certain thing is a case of fake news. And this comes back to the question, like, well, what do we want definitions of fake news for? And we kind of thought, well, here's one thing we might want a definition of fake news for. We might want a definition of fake news to help, people who are interested in clamping down on fake news regulate the phenomenon without, massively restricting free speech rights, which is something that, we don't have particular views on. We're three philosophers of language coming mostly from the theoretical end, not the ethical or political end. We don't have a particular set of views about exactly where free speech rights should extend and what exactly grounds them, but we think nonetheless, yeah, free speech seems important. If you can tamp down on a certain sort of negative phenomenon without massively tamping down on free speech in a sort of sense that we would all ordinarily recognize, that seems like a good thing. So, thinking about this sort of cluster of stuff and sort of that desiderata of having a notion of fake news that is kind of helpful for regulators or maybe social media companies in thinking about like what they're actually doing when they're trying to tamp down on this stuff. We came up with a definition that tries to get the deceptive stuff sort of out of the picture, right? So our definition, I should have looked back at this, is something to the effect of fake news is stories that sort of present themselves as journalistic, as the product of standard journalistic practice. They have certain sort of characteristic looks or other sort of keys that indicate to an audience that they are the product of standard journalistic practice, that aren't the product of standard journalistic practice, and that are widely taken up by an audience and treated as the product of standard journalistic practice. So for us, it doesn't matter whether any sort of deceptive intent was in there. We can just leave that out of the equation. We just want to ask, like, does it kind of look like journalism, right? And we think that will change over time, right? Like, journalism now in the age of Twitter looks a lot different than it did when I was a kid, right? And it came not even on websites, but in newspapers. Then the change to websites was an important shift. And change to, social media distribution of news is yet another important shift about the look, the sort of characteristic look of news. We think that that characteristic look opens up the possibility of things, being taken to be news that haven't been produced according to standard journalistic practice. And, so we think the other important element here is that being treated as the product of this, right? So we take it that, like, in its distribution, in its ordinary distribution, something like The Onion is not fake news because although it's relatively widespread and it looks like, a standard news source, it's treated by its audience not as the product of a standard journalistic practice. That said, sometimes it ends up getting decontextualized. There are a number of stories of Onion articles sort of crossing over to places in the US where it's not very well read and being sort of re-reported by local papers, and being treated as real news, or getting translated into other languages, other sort of cultural contexts where it's not a well understood thing and being treated as real news. So sort of the most famous example of this that we know of is the Iranian Fars news agency translating and reporting on an Onion article and translating bits of it, indicating that Iran's president at the time was more popular in the US than Barack Obama, which was, that was an Onion article. It was not, it might have been true, in fact, but it was not, a legitimate bit of news. And we take it that that became fake news in Iran because it was taken up as it was shared widely and it was taken up as the product of real journalistic practice, treated as that, even though it wasn't. You asked a little bit about what standard journalistic practice is. We think that that's another thing that changes over time. So we don't try to give a clear, sticky definition of that that's going to endure the test of time. We think, you just got to look at what newspapers are doing, and do your best to kind of figure out kind of what the key things are there. So, we think having eyewitness testimony is often an important part of how newspapers work. Using sort of statistical evidence in ways that aren't marked as statistical evidence tends not to be the way that they work, even if it would be more accurate, right? Building computer models that tell you what's going on is not a way that, news tends to get reported. It typically runs more on eyewitness testimony, secondhand testimony, building up circumstantial cases for things. Those are the sorts of things that we think are characteristic of standard journalistic practice. But the balance of those has changed a lot over time. As newspapers evolved, with easier means of transmission of information over longer distances, more or less resources to have people on the ground in different countries, these things have really changed. And we don't want to say that, like, there's one hard and fast rule about, like, what you have to live up to be legitimate news as opposed to fake news. We think this kind of thing is going to change over time as standard journalistic practice changes. But we think, to really understand that at a given time, you'd have to go talk to media studies people. We did our best to kind of characterize what we think the important aspects are of standard journalistic practice. Now, that tends to have to do with, yeah, using certain sorts of evidence, in particular testimony, not using other sorts of evidence like computer modeling. But that could change over time. I mean, our practices with this could and probably will change. So, yeah. And then one nice upshot, we think, of our, deception-free definition is it kind of lets you look out, it lets you figure out like what you should spend your time looking for if you're a regulator or if you're a social media company and you want to tamp down on fake news, right? So what do you look for? You look for stories that achieve widespread, are treated as the product of standard journalistic practice. We think that to figure that out, you kind of have to look how in the particular social media network that you're looking at, they're sort of used for justification for certain further claims, right? If you have claims about a massive influx of immigrants at your southern border, and you have people, sharing those stories and saying, "Oh, we got to do something about this," but those stories aren't, produced via any sort of evidence. That's a good example of fake news in the sense that we're concerned with. Does that capture everything that we sort of intuitively mean by fake news? Probably not. But we think it's sort of a useful phenomenon to be focused on if you're a regulator or a social media company, and you want to sort of help build, a better epistemic environment online, right? Like, what's the stuff you should be concerned with getting rid of, tamping down on, stuff that achieves widespread, that's treated in a certain sort of way. You don't want to get rid of the Onion articles, but the Onion articles aren't, they're not used to justify political positions, at least not in the sort of same direct way that, fake news articles often are. And you want to sort of check what kind of sources were used in, building up this article. Real news articles get things wrong sometimes. That's okay. You don't want to, start banning the, New York Times from Facebook or Twitter or whatever just because they make mistakes. They've made a lot of mistakes, a lot of mistakes. Still, like, when they figure out that journalists have made stuff up, they do tend to fire them. Not always as quickly as they should, but they do generally tend to fire them. That's sort of an important indicator that you're dealing with a different sort of entity, than I don't know, a standard source of fake news. So that seems to me like some good indicators of what, groups like social media companies or regulators maybe ought to be focusing on in trying to clean up our epistemic environment. So that's how we kind of muddled to where we were. We think some philosophers are simply interested in trying to understand our ordinary concept fake news. We're less sanguine about that project because we think it's probably a messy concept that's not, necessarily the sort of thing that you can just offer some clean, clear analysis of, and not find, counterexamples that are going to pull against it. That wasn't exactly our project. We wanted to be in the vicinity of what we naively take ourselves to be talking about, but talking about something a bit more precise that's useful for a certain kind of purpose. And we thought to really get there, you really want to get rid of that deception condition. First of all, because it doesn't match the prototype, we think, very well. And second of all, because it makes tamping down on stuff without, really getting up in people's lives and making strong assumptions about what they're up to, basically impossible. Because if you want to tamp down on that kind of fake news, you really have to know what people are thinking, whether they're self-deluded. That's just really hard. If that's hard in the best of circumstances where we actually know the people. That's really hard when you're dealing with some company, pumping out things that look like news stories that you don't have any idea, like what the workings of it are, what it's up to, what it's thinking, what its motivations are, what the people's motivations are that are part of this more complex entity. We just think that's a really hard task. Maybe we don't need to go down that road, in fact, to, clean up our online epistemic environments a bit.
Yeah, that makes sense, especially because like I think the philosophy of intent itself is already really, really complicated. Combining that with fake news just seems like an added layer of complicatedness or complexity, I guess.
Yeah, intent's a black
So like,
hole. That's really hard stuff. So like if you don't have to face up to that problem, like why? You know, yeah, that was
yeah,
basically our line of thought.
that makes a lot of sense. And I guess you already kind of touched on this a little bit, but like how do you think like the boom in AI and like kind of like generated text and all of these things and articles as well could maybe contribute to the increase of fake news? Or on the contrary, do you think that AI can be used as a mediator or stopper for fake news, i.e., creating like algorithms to like, i.e., like I don't know, like be able to recognize fake news articles or like these types of things. And then, for example, like with Twitter, Twitter has their community notes thing. Do you think those are effective strategies to like kind of deliberately move away from fake news? Or I guess this kind of also bleeds into like misinformation as well.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think you can certainly probably train algorithms helpfully to recognize stuff that looks like news and that's designed to look like news. Now, a lot of that's obviously going to be real news. So that's like first layer that's going to be very helpful in trying to weed out what we think of as fake news. If were so motivated, you know, you don't want your human checkers, if you have human checkers involved, to have to look at everything. You want to try to, you want to try to look for the stuff that looks like news. And I think you could very feasibly train algorithms to recognize that sort of stuff. And then, cut down what you need to look at to stuff that's getting a lot of uptake, right? That I think could very reasonably be expected to be automated. Um, Now, right now the AI text generators that we have, the chat bots that are getting a lot of attention these days, they have a real problem, with the truth. They seem to like to really make things up themselves, which makes them fun to play with and stuff. But doesn't necessarily make them give me immense confidence right now that they would be great at, flagging particularly problematic stories. I mean, it's a different sort of task than generating um, text, so maybe they'd be better at it. But yeah, I just don't know the kinds of limitations that engineers would be facing. I mean, one real problem here, of course, is that, to get any sort of AI to do fact checking, you have to get it, a clean set of facts to learn on, and you know, uh, that's gonna be really hard, I would imagine. Not that any of us is perfect either. I mean, so it might be that we need to get comfortable with having, AI, that we ought to get comfortable with having AI fact checkers that are more accurate than us potentially, but still not fully accurate and can be exploited if you sort of know what you're doing. That might still be better than us, or it might be something that's good in addition to us. But I think if I were to take a guess, it's going to be a while before we'd want to replace human fact checkers with, AI. The thought that we might want to supplement them with AI in various respects seems like, sure, we might be, moving towards a situation where that could be a helpful set of tools for human fact checkers to have at their disposal. But I still think at the end of the day, right now, we want human fact checkers that can make judgment calls about these sorts of the reliability of sources. you know, um, I suspect it's going to be a while before we can get AI to the point where it's going to, recognize something that's actually well sourced versus something that just goes down a sort of link rabbit hole that doesn't ground out any sort of good sourcing on the tail end. Maybe we could start to get AI to flag patterns that, look like the sourcing is illegitimate, but I suspect some of that's going to be some of those are going to be red flags that don't lead to anything real, and some are going to be real red flags, and you're still probably going to need humans to check that out for quite a while to come. But I don't know. Yeah, I don't. I'm I'm not a futurist. This is just what I gather from reading the news like anyone else. I can't claim to have any special expertise there. I just think, yeah, these are pretty tricky problems even for people to figure out. And yeah, so far it looks like our AI, our best AI, chat interfaces have some real problems with, keeping to the facts. So my confidence isn't high right now, but I could be wrong.
Yeah, and I also wanted to ask, just because as there's an increase in like AI, I guess there's also seems to be an increase in like short form content, with like headlines being a lot longer also, and like having more information, because I think there's like a move to like less of reading the actual article and more of reading the headlines. And so how do you think like fake news plays into this, in the context of like short form content, i.e. 30-second clips or like a minute clips, as opposed to like genuinely reading articles or and just reading their headlines?
Yeah, I mean, I suspect these are relatively independent of each other. I mean, there's obviously a lot of incentives in the journalism industry to, or certain parts of it at least, to generate clicks, views. Clickbait has been around for some time. Some clickbait is totally reasonable, well-sourced journalism. I mean, it turns out you can actually do informative journalism that's very quick reads, and that often is a real service if we know that this is what people tend to like. It's good that some legit journalists have learned to break complex topics down into these very quick reads, and over time get people better informed about their subject matter. That's great. I mean, would it be more ideal if we all lived in some non-rushed place where, like, we had ample time to reflect on the facts that sort of matter to us as a society and inform us as, public citizens and all the rest of it? Sure, that sounds great, but I don't know that we have any real idea how to get there. So, I have ample respect for legitimate journalists who have figured out how to get people like that much more informed in a quick soundbite. That's great. More power to you. That seems to me like, the fact that reading the news maybe isn't quite as much of an investment of time as it used to be. Seems like it can cut both ways, right? Like, people have always been rushed. Like, I don't know the extent to which people in the olden days of like my grandparents, actually really read the newspaper. I don't know what the statistics were for newspaper reading in our society. I have a lot of trouble believing it was actually, that more people were actually seriously informed reading the newspaper, et cetera, at that time than now. I mean, I think there was probably a certain sliver of people for whom it was like really important as a matter of like maintaining a certain sort of middle class respectability, that you read the newspaper every day. And they were probably better informed than many of their counterparts nowadays. I do think that's probably true. Or at least they were probably better informed about like what was going on in the US, probably not so much internationally, just because of the limitations of the technology you had at the time. But yeah, that might be true. They may have read more longer format stuff. But like, so that looms large in my life because that was sort of the middle class milieu of my grandparents. But I just have a lot of trouble believing that like people were actually, better informed. But I just don't know the statistics. That's something that we would need a historian to come on here and tell us about, which would be super interesting. But yeah, it's beyond, that's outside my my area of knowledge. So I don't really want to speculate too much there. Yeah. I mean, obviously, it would be great if we were all better read and better informed, but the demands of life are real. And like, what we want is an environment where even if you only have a couple of minutes a day to look at the headlines, those headlines are leading you in the right direction, not the wrong direction. Like, I think we should probably accept that the busyness of life is a fact of the matter for the foreseeable future, not focus on that and really focus more on trying to get people quality information, whether or not they have a lot of time on their hands.
Right. I think that makes sense. And there's definitely a lot of like short form content that, is beneficial or like has like meaning to it and it's not like fake news, i.e. the clips that we post on like TikTok and stuff like that are just like short sound bites of podcasts. But I wanted to ask, because you were talking kind of about like clickbait. So how does fake news and like more specifically on the context of like clickbait and like systems of power and domination like capitalism, how do those things relate? Because when there's like a tendency to get like more views, more money off of titles and headlines, there's like a need to make them more catchy. And those things necessarily could be like they could be like accurate representations of news, but they also could be like very, very deviant from the actual truth. So how do you think like fake news intersects with like these systems of power, mainly around like wealth and stuff?
Yeah, sure. It's a good question. And I think there's one of the things that's sort of gone relatively unnoticed in some of the philosophical literature on fake news is just how massive a shift there's been in sort of the economics of journalism in the past 30 years that I think has driven a lot of the situation that we find ourselves in now. Um, so it used to be that, to distribute news to people around the US or the UK where I live now, like you needed a lot of physical plant, right? You needed printing presses, massive printing presses. You needed a distribution network. You needed newsstands to carry your stuff. You needed, vehicles to take your newspapers to those people in a timely manner, right? Um, that was tough. That was a lot of money and investment. And what that meant was that, there was a huge barrier to entry. You had, uh, typically a few big national newspapers with a wide circulation across the country, more regional newspapers, and there was kind of what seems in retrospect like a nice sort of ecosystem of local news, national news. All of them could kind of make money because they had a pretty good stranglehold on local advertising, right? They had enough subscribers to kind of keep themselves afloat and keep their activities afloat. And, a reasonable number of the owners of these enterprises seem to have had a real commitment to trying to cover the news. I mean, a lot of them had, we shouldn't kid ourselves about this, had serious political agendas too. But they also seem to have, felt that they could only stray so far from the facts in favor of their political agendas, or they did a relatively good job of keeping their editorial pages and their news pages separate. Um, so you had a real bottleneck. You had some actors who could be sort of held accountable, either by the law in certain places or by just sort of a sense of public duty. That were, they were the sort of arbiters of what was news at the end of the day. And they seem to have done it, you know, there were obviously lots of problems with this system, right? I mean, it was systematically racist and sexist, all sorts of other things. But in terms of like reporting stuff that had some degree of accuracy, it seems to have been a kind of okay system, even if it had huge blind spots. And that was the sort of stable, semi-utopic system that we all, I think have grown up like looking back on with dewy eyes. Now, like we should not kid ourselves that it was actually as good as like we think it was. Again, huge blind spots, lots of problems at an individual level at various institutions over times. At certain periods of time, obviously some of these newspapers were just blatant political actors, often not for the good. Like we shouldn't kid ourselves about the history of journalism in the US and UK. But you could sort of see where you would apply pressure in order to try to make the news system better. And indeed, politicians at various points tried applying pressure to those publishers. And part of what's really changed is, the internet became the publisher of, news sources for a while. And now it's sort of the internet and social media networks. And we still have print media and we still have television and the rest of it. but it's your barrier to entry is way, way, way lower. So if you want to, say start a podcast, the cost of that is not like the cost of buying an industrial printing press. It's buying a decent microphone and a laptop and like some of your time, learning some software. It's not nothing, but it's nothing like what it used to be. I think we need to recognize the reality that we now live in and recognize that, social media networks, which are basically unregulated in these respects, now play effectively a lot of the structural role that publishers used to play, but don't have to live by the same rules that publishers used to live by. And some of those rules probably wouldn't be appropriate for social media networks, but it's probably inappropriate in a place like the US or the UK for them to just get a free pass. That's becoming less the case in the UK, but it's still, they get more of a free pass than publishers do. And I think that's probably right to some extent. I mean, if these things are going to live up to their promise, we want them to be a sort of commons where people can voice even, some terrible opinions, and get feedback on them. But yeah, we also don't want, them to be sort of systematically exploited by bad actors like Russia, to manipulate our elections. We want to make sure that these spaces are resilient enough and regulated enough that less of that happens in the future. So it looks like, the social media networks really are the place that as a regulator, as a government, as a politician, can exert some leverage, right? Like it's a relatively constrained body with sort of outsized power over how people are consuming the news at this point. That's relatively underregulated. It's a pressure point. It's probably the place that you should be looking to figure out how you can improve your policies. That's not really, there's nothing really philosophical about that, right? That's just some observations about the changing economics of that system that we certainly aren't the first ones to point out. But that combined with a hopefully somewhat useful definition of fake news might open up some possibilities of how you could implement policies to do better in these spaces that might have an effect on people. There's probably a range of things you could try to do, but it suggests at least some ways of going that might do a little bit better than what we currently have.
Right. I mean, I think I never really considered that, probably just because like I'm young, and so like I never really got into the newspapers anyways, so never really considered like printing presses and all of those things. My kind of like way of like my general understanding of like the news is based off of social media networks or like just straight through their websites, which is all like a digital understanding of the news. So like it's interesting to see how like that changes based off of generation and will continue to change based off of generation. But like that about wraps up our discussion today on like fake news and misinformation. But I did want to ask you like what you're doing now, if there's any new research that you're interested in, and what you're kind of focusing on now.
Sure. I mean, my project with Jessica and Rachel is still ongoing. We have been working on a piece on the relation between fake news and fiction, which turns out to be a kind of vexing, distinction to try and draw. Yeah, we've been working on another piece on what we're calling amplification. So it looks like speech online very naturally does something that offline speech can do, but it's harder to do, which we, just to give it a name, we're calling amplification. This is something like, making whatever you're responding to more prominent in the conversation. Or really making another piece of speech more prominent in the conversation. So offline, in ordinary face-to-face conversation, if you make a nice point, and I can tell that not everyone has appreciated your point, I can say something like, oh, Saurish made a really nice point. And then I can sort of do my best to summarize it, or I could quote you, verbatim. And that sort of raises that point back to prominence. But online, it looks like basically any interaction that you have with, say, a post of text, just for the easiest kind of case, makes it more likely that other people are going to see that post, that original post. That's really, really different than our offline conversations, right? Our offline conversations, you can just let something drop, and move on. There's not really a way to sort of do that in an ongoing online conversation. Even downvoting something on Reddit to the I'm not on Reddit, so I have to rely on my on information from my wife for this, who loves Reddit, Reddit's like gardening forums, which do seem to be very informative, I have to say, as a sort of passive consumer of them. But yeah, so like even stuff getting downvoted on Reddit makes it actually, as best I understand it, more prominent when you're scrolling through. Like if something gets downvoted a ton, that doesn't mean that it's less likely to be seen. And the reason for that is obviously pretty simple. It goes back to the economics of this, right? Like these companies want interaction. So stuff that gets downvoted a lot is getting a lot of interaction. Obviously, people are responding to it. That's what these companies want, because that's how they sell advertisements, right? They want our attention. Our attention is the product that they can sell to advertisers, right? So they want to know what's going to get interaction. And even if that interaction is, God, this is terrible, this is hate speech, you really shouldn't be saying this, like this person should be banned from Twitter. Twitter's algorithms are going to take that and be like, cool, interaction, like put that more prominently. So it's really, this is very different than our offline environments where you really can let things drop. Or if you want to confront a bit of speech, you can do that in a way where like only the people there are going to hear this, and like it might be salient for them, but it doesn't have effects on like, a hugely broader swath of the population that, is your followers and followers, followers and followers, followers, followers. And even beyond that, because to some extent, Twitter just cares about what's popular in your geographic area, whether or not you're linked to the person, or just what's popular on Twitter today. What's the main character of Twitter up to, right? Like Twitter cares about that. And that can be really bad if what you're trying to do is confront hate speech. That makes it very perplexing what we should do when we see really bad instances of speech, and it leaves us open to what my friend John Scott Railton, who's a sort of privacy investigator and activist, calls rage farming. I don't think he came up with this term, I just happen to know it from him. But right, where someone tries to generate really negative reactions to a Twitter post, but that's much more likely to make it seen by a lot of people. So the Republican Party, their various Twitter accounts often misspell intentionally certain terms, because Democrats, we go crazy for that stuff, right? Like we hate it. We're like, oh my God, you idiots. Like you don't even know how to spell this right. You don't even know how to spell immigrants right when you're insulting them. They're doing that intentionally. They're not doing that by accident, because that gets them tens of thousands of angry Democrats posting on their feed, which means this is way more likely to be seen by more people, Republican and Democrat alike. That's exactly what they want, right? So this really changes what our sort of appropriate reactions are, restructures our speech environments in ways that, I think are just very foreign to us. And I think we're gonna have to learn to live with, but I don't think we're there yet. I think when you see rage farming, you can see people have not made this leap to the effects of what they're doing, to understanding the effects of what they're doing. And they're still operating as though they're in an offline environment. And that's getting us into a lot of trouble. And part of that's on us because we need to adapt. And obviously, a lot of that is on these companies that are making money by monetizing our attention, and probably need to be incentivized to do that in a way that doesn't lead to some of these effects. Yeah, so
No,
that's sort of stuff I'm thinking about with Jessica and Rachel. I have stuff on my own too, but since we were talking about the fake news stuff, that's the sort of most natural stuff to say too.
right. Yeah, no, for sure. I think that is a really, really interesting question, especially about like the division between like offline and online, Just like that's an interesting kind of like, I don't know, intersection or like kind of way to look at things, because yeah, it's really, really different from how we act in person as opposed to online. And maybe what I can do is I can drop a link to your website in the description of the video. So if you are interested, you can be up to date on Dr. Michelson's like research on their website. But that's about it for today's episode. Thanks so much, Dr. Michelson, for your time today. I learned a lot, and I'm sure our audience did as well.
Thanks for having me. Really appreciate it.